The Tibetan sovereignty debate refers to two political debates. The first is whether the various territories within the People's Republic of China that are claimed as political Tibet should separate and become a new sovereign state. Many of the points in the debate rest on a second debate, about whether Tibet was independent or subordinate to China in certain parts of its recent history. It is generally agreed that China and Tibet were independent prior to the Yuan dynasty, and that Tibet has been ruled by the People's Republic of China since 1959. The nature of Tibet's relationship with China in the intervening period is a matter of debate. The PRC claims that Tibet has been a part of China since the Yuan dynasty. The Republic of China claimed that Tibet was placed under the sovereignty of China when the Qing dynasty ended the brief Nepalese rule from parts of Tibet in c. 1793. The Tibetan government in exile claims that Tibet was an independent state until the PRC invaded Tibet in 1949–50. Some Western scholars claim that Tibet and China were ruled by the Mongols during the Yuan dynasty, that Tibet was independent during the Chinese Ming dynasty, and that Tibet was ruled by China as subordinate to the king during much of the Qing dynasty. Some Western scholars also claim that Tibet was independent from c. 1912 to 1950, although it had extremely limited international recognition. The view of the Chinese governments. The government of the People's Republic of China contends that it has had control over Tibet since the Yuan dynasty. The government of the Republic of China, which ruled mainland China from 1912 until 1949 and now controls Taiwan, had a cabinet-level Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission in charge of the administration of Tibetan Mongolia regions from 1912. The commission retained its cabinet-level status after 1949, but no longer executes that function. On 10 May 1943, Chiang Kai-shek asserted that Tibet is part of Chinese territory. No foreign nation is allowed to interfere in our domestic affairs. He again declared in 1946 that the Tibetans were Chinese nationals. The Republic of China still claims sovereignty over Tibetan Mongolia in its constitution. In the late 19th century, China adopted the Western model of nation-state diplomacy. As the government of Tibet, China concluded several treaties with British India touching on the status, boundaries and access to Tibet. Chinese government sources consider this a sign of sovereignty rather than suzerainty. However, by the 20th century, British India found the treaties to be ineffective due to China's weakened control over the Tibetan local government. The British invaded Tibet in 1904 and forced the signing of a separate treaty directly with the Tibetan government in Lhasa. In 1906, an Anglo-Chinese convention was signed at Peking between Great Britain and China. It incorporated the 1904 Lhasa Convention, which was attached as Annex. A treaty between Britain and Russia followed. Article 2 of this treaty stated that, in conformity with the admitted principle of the suzerainty of China over Tibet, Great Britain and Russia engaged not to enter into negotiations with Tibet except through the intermediary of the Chinese government. China sent troops into Tibet in 1908. The result of the policy of both Great Britain and Russia has been the virtual annexation of Tibet by China. China controlled Tibet up to 1912. Thereafter, Tibet entered the period described commonly as de facto independence, though it was only recognized by independent Mongolia as enjoying de jure independence. In the 2000s, the position of the Republic of China with regard to Tibet appeared to become more nuanced, as was stated in the following opening speech to the International Symposium on Human Rights in Tibet on 8 September 2007 through the pro-Taiwan independence then-ROC President Chen Shui-bian, who stated that his offices no longer treated exiled Tibetans as Chinese mainlanders. Legal arguments based on historical status. The position of the People's Republic of China, which has ruled mainland China since 1949, as well as the official position of the Republic of China, which ruled mainland China before 1949 and currently controls Taiwan, is that Tibet has been an indivisible part of China de jure since the Yuan dynasty of Mongol ruled China in the 13th century, comparable to other states such as the Kingdom of Dali and the Tangut Empire that were also incorporated into China at the time. The PRC contends that, according to international law and the succession of states theory, all subsequent Chinese governments have succeeded the Yuan dynasty in exercising de jure sovereignty over Tibet, with the PRC having succeeded the ROC as the legitimate government of all China. Unique ethnicity. According to the PRC, successive Chinese governments have recognized Tibet as having its own unique culture and language. However, they believe that this situation does not necessarily argue in favor of its independence, because China has over 56 unique ethnic groups and is one of many multinational states in the world. De facto independence. The ROC government had no effective control over Tibet from 1912 to 1951. However, in the opinion of the Chinese government, this condition does not represent Tibet's independence, as many other parts of China also enjoyed de facto independence when the Chinese nation was torn by warlordism, Japanese invasion, and civil war. Goldstein explains what is meant by de facto independence in the following statement: Instead adopted a policy based on the idea of autonomy for Tibet within the context of Chinese suzerainty, that is to say, de facto independence for Tibet in the context of token subordination to China. Britain articulated this policy in the Simla Accord of 1914. While at times the Tibetans were fiercely independent-minded, at other times Tibet indicated its willingness to accept subordinate status as part of China provided that Tibetan internal systems were left untouched and China relinquished control over a number of important ethnic Tibetan groups in Kham and Amdo. The PRC insists that during this period the ROC government continued to maintain sovereignty over Tibet. The Provisional Constitution of the Republic of China stipulated that Tibet was a province of the Republic of China. Provisions concerning Tibet in the Constitution of the Republic of China promulgated later all stress the inseparability of Tibet from Chinese territory, and the central government of China exercise of sovereignty in Tibet. In 1927, the commission in charge of Mongolian and Tibetan affairs of the Chinese government contained members of great influence in the Mongolian and Tibetan areas, such as the 13th Dalai Lama, the 9th Panchen Lama and other Tibetan government representatives. In 1934, on his condolence mission for the demise of the Dalai Lama, the Chinese general Hu Wang Musong posted notices in Chinese and Tibetan throughout Lhasa that alluded to Tibet as an integral part of China while expressing the utmost reverence for the Dalai Lama and the Buddhist religion. The 9th Panchen Lama traditionally ruled over one-third of Tibet. On the 1st of February 1925, the Panchen Lama attended the preparatory session of the National Reconstruction meeting intended to identify ways and means of unifying the Chinese nation, and gave a speech about achieving the unification of 5 nationalities, including Tibetans, Mongolians and Han Chinese. In 1933, he called upon the Mongols to embrace national unity and to obey the Chinese government to resist Japanese invasion. In February 1935, the Chinese government appointed Panchen Lama Special Cultural Commissioner for the Western regions and assigned him 500 Chinese troops. He spent much of his time teaching and preaching Buddhist doctrines, including the principles of unity and pacification for the border regions, extensively in inland China, outside of Tibet, from 1924 until the 1st of December 1937, when he died on his way back to Tibet under the protection of Chinese troops. During the Sino-Tibetan War, the warlords Ma Bufang and Lu Wenwei jointly attacked and defeated invading Tibetan forces. The Kuomintang government sought to portray itself as necessarily to validate the choice of the Dalai Lama and Panchen Lama. When the current Dalai Lama was installed in Lhasa, it was with an armed escort of Chinese troops and an attending Chinese minister. The Muslim Kuomintang General Bai Chongshi said that the Tibetans suffered under British repression, and he called upon the Republic of China to assist them in expelling the British. According to Yu Shiyu, during China's resistance war against Japanese invasion, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the Chinese Muslim General Ma Bufang, governor of Qinghai, to repair the Yushu airport in Qinghai province to deter Tibetan independence. In May 1943, Chiang warned that Tibet must accept and follow the instructions and orders of the central government, that they must agree and help to build the Chinese-India Road, and that they must maintain direct communications with the office of the Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs Commission in Lhasa and not through the newly established Foreign Office of Tibet. He sternly warned that he would send an air force to bomb Tibet immediately should Tibet be found to be collaborating with Japan. Official communications between Lhasa and Chiang Kai-shek's government was through MTAC, not the Foreign Office, until July 1949, just before the Communists' final victory in the Civil War. The presence of MTAC in Lhasa was viewed by both nationalist and communist governments as an assertion of Chinese sovereignty over Tibet. Throughout the Kuomintang years, no country gave Tibet diplomatic recognition. In 1950, after the People's Liberation Army entered Tibet, Indian leader Jawaharlal Nehru stated that his country would continue the British policy with regards to Tibet in considering it to be outwardly part of China but internally autonomous. Foreign interventions. The PRC considers all pro-independence movements aimed at ending Chinese sovereignty in Tibet, including British attempts to establish control in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the CIA's backing of Tibetan insurgents during the 1950s and 1960s, and the government of Tibet in exile till the turn of the 21st century, as one long campaign abetted by Western imperialism aimed at destroying Chinese territorial integrity and sovereignty, or destabilizing China. Until 2008, the British position remained the same, that China held suzerainty over Tibet but not sovereignty. It was the only state still to hold this view, which it revised on the 29th of October 2008, when the British Foreign Office recognized Chinese sovereignty over Tibet by issuing a statement on its website. The Economist stated that although the Foreign Office's website does not use the word sovereignty, officials at the Foreign Office said it means that, as far as Britain is concerned, Tibet is part of China. Full stop. The New York Times commented on the American policy during the 1960s, saying that it was part of the CIA's efforts to undermine communist regimes. After the end of the Cold War, the United States uses the National Endowment for Democracy to primarily support Tibetan independence groups. The view of the Tibetan government and subsequent government in exile. Government of Tibet. A proclamation issued by 13th Dalai Lama in 1913 states, during the time of Genghis Khan and Altan Khan of the Mongols, the Ming dynasty of the Chinese, and the Qing dynasty of the Manchus, Tibet and China cooperated on the basis of benefactor and priest relationship. The existing relationship between Tibet and China had been that of patron and priest and had not been based on the subordination of one to the other. Quote, he condemned that the Chinese authorities in Sichuan and Yunnan endeavored to colonize our territory Chinese in 1910–12 and stated that we are a small, religious, and independent nation. Tibetan Passports. In 2003, an old Tibetan passport was rediscovered in Nepal, issued by the Kashag to Tibet's finance minister Sapan Shakabpa for foreign travel. The passport was a single piece of pink paper, complete with photograph. It has a message in handwritten Tibetan and typed English, similar to the message by the nominal issuing offices of today's passports, stating that the bearer of this letter, Sapan Shakabpa, chief of the finance department of the government of Tibet, is hereby sent to China, the United States of America, the United Kingdom and other countries to explore and review trade possibilities between these countries and Tibet. We shall, therefore, be grateful if all the governments concerned on his route would kindly give due recognition as such, grant necessary passport, visa, etc., without any hindrance, and render assistance in all possible ways to him. The text and the photograph is sealed by a square stamp belonging to the Kashag, and is dated 26th day of the 8th month of Fire Pig year. The passport has received visas and entry stamps from several countries and territories, including India, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Switzerland, Pakistan, Iraq and Hong Kong, but not China. Some visa reflect an official status, with mentions such as diplomatic courtesy, service visa, official gratis, diplomatic visa, for government official. However, acceptance of a passport does not indicate recognition of independence, as for example the Republic of China passport is accepted by almost all the countries of the world, even though few of them recognize the ROC as independent. Tibet government in exile. In 1959, the 14th Dalai Lama fled Tibet and established a government in exile at Dharamshala in northern India. This group claims sovereignty over various ethnically or historically Tibetan areas now governed by China. Aside from the Tibet Autonomous Region, an area that was administered directly by the Dalai Lama's government until 1951, the group also claims Amdo and Eastern Kham. About 45% of ethnic Tibetans under Chinese rule live in the Tibet Autonomous Region, according to the 2000 census. Prior to 1949, much of Amdo and Eastern Kham were governed by local rulers and even warlords. The view of the current Dalai Lama in 1989 was as follows. During the 5th Dalai Lama's time, I think it was quite evident that we were a separate sovereign nation with no problems. The 6th Dalai Lama was spiritually preeminent, but politically, he was weak and uninterested. He could not follow the 5th Dalai Lama's path. This was a great failure. So, then the Chinese influence increased. During this time, the Tibetans showed quite a deal of respect to the Chinese. But even during these times, the Tibetans never regarded Tibet as a part of China. All the documents were very clear that China, Mongolia and Tibet were all separate countries. Because the Chinese emperor was powerful and influential, the small nations accepted the Chinese power or influence. You cannot use the previous invasion as evidence that Tibet Tibet belongs to China. In the Tibetan mind, regardless of who was in power, whether it was the Manchus, the Mongols of the Chinese, the east of Tibet was simply referred to as China. In the Tibetan mind, India and China were treated the same, two separate countries. The International Commission of Jurists concluded that, from 1913 to 1950, Tibet demonstrated the conditions of statehood as generally accepted under international law. In the opinion of the Commission, the government of Tibet conducted its own domestic and foreign affairs free from any outside authority, and countries with whom Tibet had foreign relations are shown by official documents to have treated Tibet in practice as an independent state. The United Nations General Assembly passed resolutions urging respect for the rights of Tibetans in 1959, 1961 and 1965. The 1961 resolution calls for that principle of self-determination of peoples and nations applies to the Tibetan people. The Tibetan government in exile views current PRC rule in Tibet, including neighboring provinces outside Tibet Autonomous Region, as colonial and illegitimate, motivated solely by the natural resources and strategic value of Tibet, and in gross violation of both Tibet's historical status as an independent country and the right of Tibetan people to self-determination. It also points to PRC's autocratic policies, divide-and-rule policies, and what it contends are assimilationist policies, and regard those as an example of ongoing imperialism aimed at destroying Tibet's distinct ethnic makeup, culture, and identity, thereby cementing it as an indivisible part of China. That said, the Dalai Lama stated in 2008 that he wishes only for Tibetan autonomy and not separation from China under certain conditions, like freedom of speech and expression, genuine self-rule, and control over ethnic makeup and migration in all areas claimed as historical Tibet. Third-party views. During the rule of the Chinese Tang dynasty, Tibet and China were frequently at war with parts of Tibet temporarily captured by the Chinese to become part of the territory. Around 650, the Chinese captured Lhasa. In 763, Tibet very briefly took the Chinese capital of Chang'an during the Tang Civil War. Most scholars outside of China say that during the Ming dynasty, Tibet was independent without even nominal Ming suzerainty. In contrast, since the mid-18th century it is agreed that China had control over Tibet, reaching its maximum in the end of the 18th century. Luciano Pitek, a scholar of Himalayan history, indicated that Tibet was a king protectorate. The patron and priest relationship held between the king court and the Tibetan lamas has been subjected to varying interpretation. The 13th Dalai Lama, for example, knelt but did not kowtow before the Empress Dowager Cixi and the young emperor while he delivered his petition in Beijing. Chinese sources emphasize the submission of kneeling. Tibetan sources emphasize the lack of the kowtow. Titles and commands given to Tibetans by the Chinese, likewise, are variously interpreted. The Qing authorities gave the 13th Dalai Lama the title of loyally submissive vice-regent, and ordered to follow Qing's commands and communicate with the emperor only through the Manchu Amban in Lhasa, but opinions vary as to whether these titles and commands reflected actual political power, or symbolic gestures ignored by Tibetans. Some authors claim that kneeling before the emperor followed the 17th century precedent in the case of the 5th Dalai Lama. Other historians indicate that the emperor treated the Dalai Lama as an equal. Kneeling was a compromise allowed by the king court for foreign representatives, Western and Tibetan alike, as both parties refused to perform the kowtow. Tibetologist Melvin C. Goldstein writes that Britain and Russia formally acknowledged Chinese authority over Tibet in treaties of 1906 and 1907, and that the 1904 British invasion of Tibet stirred China into becoming more directly involved in Tibetan affairs and working to integrate Tibet with the rest of China. The status of Tibet after the 1911 Xinhai Revolution ended the Qing dynasty is also a matter of debate. After the revolution, the Chinese Republic of Five Races, including Tibetans, was proclaimed. Western powers recognized the Chinese Republic. However, the 13th Dalai Lama proclaimed Tibet's independence. Some authors indicate that personal allegiance of the Dalai Lama to the Manchu Emperor came to an end and no new type of allegiance of Tibet to China was established, or that Tibet had relationships with the empire and not with the new nation-state of China. Barnett observes that there is no document before 1950 in which Tibet explicitly recognizes Chinese sovereignty, and considers Tibet's subordination to China during the periods when China had most authority comparable to that of a colony. Tibetologist Elliot Sperling noted that the Tibetan term for China, Rgyanag, did not mean anything more than a country bordering Tibet from the east, and did not include Tibet. Other Tibetologists write that no country publicly accepts Tibet as an independent state, although there are several instances of government officials appealing to the superiors to do so. Treaties signed by Britain and Russia in the early years of the 20th century, and others signed by Nepal and India in the 1950s, recognized Tibet's political subordination to China. The United States presented a similar viewpoint in 1943. Goldstein also says that a 1943 British official letter reconfirmed that Britain considered Tibet as part of China. Thomas Hebra, professor of political science and East Asian studies at the University of Duisburg-Essen, Germany, wrote, "No country in the world has ever recognized the independence of Tibet or declared that Tibet is an occupied country. For all countries in the world, Tibet is Chinese territory." Quote, however, newly independent Mongolia and Tibet recognized each other by a treaty signed just after the fall of the Qing dynasty, and under international law, even non-recognition by other states does not negate even unilateral declaration of independence. During the early 1990s, governmental bodies, including the European Union and United States Congress, and other international organizations declared that Tibetans lacked the enjoyment of self-determination to which they are entitled and that it is an occupied territory. In 2008, European Union leader José Manuel Barroso stated that the EU recognized Tibet as integral part of China. On the 1st of April 2009, the French government reaffirmed its position on the Tibet issue. In 2014, U.S. President Barack Obama stated that, "We recognized Tibet as part of the People's Republic of China. We are not in favor of independence." This lack of legal recognition makes it difficult for international legal experts sympathetic to the Tibetan government in exile to argue that Tibet formally established its independence. On the other hand, in 1959 and 1960 the International Commission of Jurists concluded that Tibet had been independent between 1913 and 1950, while Canadian foreign policy and Canada's policy toward Tibet is strictly limited to supporting human rights. Canada has nonetheless recognized that the Tibetan people's human rights expressly include the right to self-determination.